hostess looked me up and down like I was someone who'd wandered in off the street. "Sir, this event is private. I don't see your name here." I said, "My name is Edmund Cole. I'm the groom's father." She didn't even blink. "I'm sorry. The list is final. You'll need to step outside." I stepped outside. I stood on the sidewalk in front of the Harrington Grand, a hotel I had stayed at 31 times over the course of my career, a hotel where I had hosted board dinners and retirement celebrations, and one very long night in 1997 when a deal I'd spent 8 months building finally closed. I stood on that sidewalk in my good suit, the one my wife Eleanor had picked out for me 2 years before she passed, and I took out my phone. I made one call. By the end of the night, I had a seat at my own son's wedding. But let me back up. My son's name is Patrick. He's 34 years old and works in commercial real estate, a career I helped him start and a firm I helped him get his foot in the door of with contacts I had spent 30 years building. Patrick is not a bad person. I want to say that clearly, because what happened that night was not entirely Patrick. Patrick is a good man who makes poor decisions when a certain person is standing next to him. That person is his wife, Gwendolyn. I tried to like Gwendolyn. I genuinely did. When Patrick first brought her home for Thanksgiving 4 years ago, I made her feel welcome. I asked about her family, her work, her interests. She was pleasant enough at the table. Polished, the way certain people are polished. Like a surface that reflects light without letting anything in. She smiled at my jokes. She complimented the turkey. She asked to use the bathroom and I showed her where it was, and when she came back she was on her phone and she stayed on her phone for most of the afternoon. I told myself she was nervous. Meeting the father is nerve-wracking for anyone, but over the next 2 years, I started to notice things. Little things at first. Patrick stopped calling on Sundays. Then he stopped calling unless I called first. He missed my birthday dinner, then my retirement party, then the anniversary of his mother's passing, which the three of us had always marked together with dinner at her favorite Italian place in Midtown. I sat at that table alone that year with a glass of Chianti and her photograph, and I told myself he was busy. Young couples are busy. Then came the engagement. He called to tell me, which I appreciated. His voice sounded happy, the real kind, and I was glad. I told him I loved him and I was proud of him, and I meant every word. I asked when I could take them both to dinner to celebrate. There was a pause. "We're pretty slammed with planning right now, Dad," he said. "We'll figure something out." We never figured something out. I found out about the venue from a cousin of mine who had heard it through the family grapevine. The Harrington Grand, black tie, 300 guests. I looked it up online and the ballroom rental alone ran $40,000 on a Saturday in May. I did not ask Patrick how he was paying for it. I assumed he was doing well. I was glad he was doing well. What I did not know at that point was that Patrick had asked Gwendolyn's parents to help cover the cost, and that Gwendolyn's parents had declined, and that 2 weeks before the wedding, Patrick had quietly withdrawn $62,000 from a joint investment account that he and I had opened together 11 years ago, when I was trying to teach him about long-term thinking. I did not know that yet. What I did know was that I had received an invitation in the mail, formal and cream-colored with gold embossed lettering, and that my name was on it. Edmund Cole. Seat reserved. Reception to follow. I drove myself to the Harrington Grand on the evening of May 17th. I wore the suit Eleanor had chosen. I arrived at 6:45, 15 minutes before the ceremony start, and I handed my invitation to the young woman at the entrance table. She scanned something on her tablet, scanned it again, looked up at me. "I'm sorry, sir. You're not showing as confirmed." I told her I had received a printed invitation with my name on it. She said the list was the list. I asked to speak to a manager. A man in a headset came over, looked at the same tablet, and told me the same thing with a more apologetic expression. Behind him, I could see guests filing in. Women in evening gowns, men in tuxedos, the murmur of a string quartet drifting through the open doors. I stepped outside. I stood on that sidewalk for a moment, and I breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way my doctor has been telling me to do since my blood pressure started climbing 2 years ago. I looked at the marquee above the entrance. The Harrington Grand. I had a very specific memory of this building that came to me right then, standing on that sidewalk in my good suit. 22 years ago, I had been introduced at a dinner in this building to a man named Curtis Baird, who was looking to sell a small portfolio of midtown commercial properties, and had not yet found a buyer he trusted. We shook hands at that dinner. 3 months later, I was one of 4 investors who closed on those properties. I had long since sold my stake at a considerable gain, but Curtis and I had stayed in touch. We had lunched twice a year. He sent me a card every Christmas. Curtis Baird's son now sat on the board of the group that managed the Harrington Grand. I took out my phone. Curtis picked up on the second ring, the way he always does, because Curtis Baird is a man who answers his phone. I told him where I was. I told him what had happened. I did not exaggerate or editorialize. I simply told him the facts. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Give me 10 minutes, Ed." I stood on the sidewalk and watched taxis pull up and guests step out in their finery. A woman dropped her clutch and a doorman retrieved it for her. A father straightened his son's bow tie on the steps. I watched that without feeling anything particular about it. My phone buzzed. Curtis said, "The director of events is going to come out and find you. Her name is Patricia. She's going to take care of you." Patricia came out 3 minutes later. She was brisk and professional and deeply apologetic in the way that hospitality professionals are when something has gone wrong on their watch. She walked me inside personally, found me a seat in the 3rd row on the groom's side, and made sure I had a program. I sat down. I did not look for Patrick. I did not want to see his face before I had decided what I was going to do with what I was feeling. I sat in that seat, and I listened to the string quartet play something I didn't recognize. And I looked at the white roses arranged along the aisle, and I thought about Eleanor. She would have been here tonight. She would have cried happy tears from the moment she walked in. She would have squeezed my hand during the vows and whispered something in my ear about how she remembered the night Patrick was born. How small he was. How he had curled his whole fist around her finger. She was not here. I was here. And I had almost not been. The ceremony was beautiful. I will give it that. The officiant was warm and funny, and Patrick cried when Gwendolyn came down the aisle, which made the crying women around me cry harder. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, and I watched my son get married, and I felt the specific ache of loving someone who has been slowly taught to keep their distance from you. The reception moved to the main ballroom. I found my seat at a table near the back, a table I had not been assigned to, a table that Patricia had quietly arranged for me among some of Patrick's college friends who did not know exactly who I was, but were friendly enough. I drank a glass of water and ate the salad. Then Patrick's best man, a young man named Theo, stood up and tapped his champagne glass and began his toast. It was a fine toast, the kind that lands well with a room full of people who already love the groom. There were a few laughs, a few warm moments. At the end, Theo raised his glass and said, "To Patrick and Gwendolyn, may you always take care of each other the way the people who love you have taken care of you." There was applause. I looked at my glass and I thought about $62,000. I had not known about the account yet. I want to be precise about the timeline because it matters. What I had known, walking into that ballroom, was that I had been left off a guest list for my own son's wedding. What I had suspected for some time was that the distance between Patrick and me had been carefully managed by someone other than Patrick. What I had not yet known was the money. That came from my accountant, a man named Walter Briggs, who called me the following Monday morning. I was still at home in my bathrobe with the weekend papers. Walter had been reviewing the annual statements on our joint account, which we still held together as a long-term vehicle, even though Patrick and I had not spoken about it in years. He had noticed a withdrawal, a large one. He wanted to make sure I had authorized it. I had not authorized it. I sat with that information for 2 days. I did not call Patrick. I did not call a lawyer. I sat with it the way I have learned to sit with difficult things since Eleanor died, which is to let the initial heat of it pass before you decide what to do. On the 3rd day, I called my attorney, a woman named Sheila Drummond who had handled my business affairs for 19 years, and I asked her to look into it. Sheila called me back the following Thursday afternoon, and she did not waste words. Patrick has signature authority on the account from when it was established, she said. Legally, he could access those funds. Whether he should have is a different question. I asked her what my options were. She told me. I thought about it overnight, and then I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Patrick. He picked up on the 4th ring. His voice had that careful quality it gets when he knows something is coming, a guardedness I recognized from his teenage years, from the times I had called him to account for something. Dad." "Patrick," I said, "I need to talk to you about the Clearwater account." A long silence. "Dad, I'm not calling to argue," I said. "I'm calling because I want to understand." He told me. It came out slowly at first, and then all at once, the way things do when someone has been holding them too long. The wedding costs had ballooned. Gwendolyn's parents had pulled out at the last minute. He had panicked. He had told himself he would pay it back. He had not told Gwendolyn about the account, or not the full picture of it, and she had not known where the money was coming from, and he was sorry. He was genuinely sorry. He just hadn't known what else to do. I listened to all of it. "Were you going to tell me?" I asked. Another silence. Then, quietly, "I don't know." I said, "Patrick, I need you to hear me. Not as your accountant, not as someone who was angry with you, but as your father. The money I can absorb. What I cannot absorb is being removed from your life. I was left off the guest list for your wedding. I stood on the sidewalk outside the Harrington Grand for 10 minutes wondering if my son wanted me there. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "That wasn't me." I knew it wasn't entirely him, but I also knew that the man I raised would not have let it happen without a fight. "Then you need to decide who you want to be," I said. "I'm not asking you to choose between me and your wife. I'm asking you to remember that you have a father who loves you and would like to be present for your life." I heard him breathe. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm so sorry." I believed him. That's the thing about Patrick that Gwendolyn has never quite understood. I know when my son is telling the truth, because I have known him since the moment he entered the world, and I have been paying attention ever since. We agreed to meet for dinner the following week, just the two of us, the way we used to do when he was in his 20s, and would call me on a Thursday to say he was in the neighborhood. We went to an Italian place in Midtown, not the one Eleanor loved, a different one without any weight attached to it. We talked for 3 hours. I told him things I'd never said out loud, about how hard the years since his mother passed had been, about how much I'd been hoping to move into this next chapter with my son beside me. He told me things too, about the pressure, about how Gwendolyn sometimes made him feel, that his family was a problem to be managed rather than people to be loved, about how he had let it happen because it was easier than the alternative, and because he loved her, and he had not known how to hold two truths at once. I told him that holding two truths at once was the whole job of being a grown man. He laughed at that. A real laugh, the one I hadn't heard in 2 years. I did not demand that he repay the $62,000. I told Sheila to restructure the account so that it required dual authorization going forward, and I let it go. The money was never the point. The money was a symptom. The point was the sidewalk. The point was the suit Eleanor picked out for me, and the seat I almost didn't have, and the string quartet I almost didn't hear, and my son's face when he cried watching the woman he loves walk toward him down an aisle I was nearly not there to see. There's a particular loneliness that comes with being an older man, a widower, a father whose child has grown and moved into a world that doesn't always have room for you in it. People don't talk about it much. You're supposed to be proud and self-sufficient and unbothered. You're supposed to nod and say they grow up so fast and mean it without reservation. You're not supposed to stand on the sidewalk in your good suit wondering if your son wants you at his wedding. But that is what I did. And then I made a phone call. And then I walked into that ballroom and I watched Patrick promise his life to someone, and even with all of it, all the grief and the distance and the $62,000 and the name that wasn't on the list, I was glad I was there. I was glad I had the number of someone who picked up on the second ring. I was glad I hadn't gone home. 3 months after the wedding, Patrick called me on a Sunday. Out of the blue, the way he used to. He said he and Gwendolyn were going to be in my area and could they come for dinner. I said yes. I made the pot roast Eleanor used to make. I found the recipe in her handwriting in the old blue binder in the kitchen cabinet, the one I haven't been able to move since she died. I stood at the stove in my kitchen and I cooked for my son and his wife. And when they arrived, Gwendolyn was quieter than usual, more careful, the way a person is when they know more has been said about them than they've heard. She helped me set the table. At one point, she picked up a framed photograph from the sideboard, the one of Patrick at about 7 years old, gap-toothed and laughing, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair. She looked at it for a long moment. "He still makes that face," she said, "when something really gets him." I said, "I know." She put the photograph down and straightened it carefully, and I thought that maybe in the long run, there was still something workable between us, that the story did not have to end on a sidewalk. We ate, we talked. Patrick told a story about a deal that had gone sideways and made us all laugh. Gwendolyn asked me about my work, the old career, and I told her some of it, the parts that made good dinner conversation. When they left, Patrick hugged me at the door, a real hug, both arms, the kind I had not felt from him in longer than I could remember. "Same time next month?" he said. "Same time next month," I said. I stood in my doorway and watched the taillights disappear down the street, and then I went inside and washed the dishes and turned off the kitchen light. The house was quiet. It is always quiet, but that night, the quiet felt different, softer somehow, like a room that has recently had people in it and still holds a little of their warmth. I thought about Eleanor. I told her how it went. I told her how it went. I told her he made that same face. The one from the county fair, gape-toothed and laughing and completely, entirely himself. I told her I hadn't missed it after all. I've thought a lot about that sidewalk. Not with bitterness, not anymore, but with the kind of clarity that only comes after the heat has passed and you can finally see a thing for what it was. What happened to me that night at the Harrington Grand was not an accident. It was the result of a long chain of small choices, and every link in that chain had a consequence. Patrick chose silence when he should have spoken. Gwendolyn chose control when she should have chosen welcome. I, for my part, had chosen patience for so long that I had nearly let it become invisibility. Every one of those choices led to a man standing on a sidewalk in his best suit, wondering whether his son wanted him there. That's how life works, in my experience. Not dramatically, not all at once, quietly, incrementally. You make a choice, and that choice shapes the next one, and somewhere down the road, you end up somewhere you never intended to be, and you have to decide whether you're going to stand there or do something about it. I made a call that matters, not because of who I knew or what it got me, but because I refused to accept that the story ended on that sidewalk. That refusal, that small, stubborn refusal to go home, is the thing I'm most proud of from that entire night. Not the seat, not the ballroom. The decision to stay. What I've learned at 67 years old is that character isn't built in the big moments. It's built in the quiet ones. It's built in the way you treat people when you think no one is paying attention, in the way you handle money that isn't really yours to take, in the way you decide, over and over again, whether to tell the truth or find an easier path. Patrick had been choosing the easier path for 2 years. I understood it because I have chosen easier paths myself. But understanding something doesn't mean accepting it. The $62,000 was never the point. I want to be clear about that. The point was that my son had looked at a problem and reached for what was nearest and most convenient, without stopping to think about what it meant or who it touched. That is not a financial failure. That is a failure of judgment. And judgment is something you can only develop by being willing to think hard about hard things. By sitting with discomfort long enough to understand it rather than just escape it. Gwendolyn is not a villain in this story, despite how it may have looked for a while. She is a woman who needed to control things because that is how she felt safe, and she had married a man who let her, because that is how he felt loved. Two people doing the best they knew how, and still managing to cause real harm. That's the most common tragedy there is. What changed things was not the confrontation. It was the conversation. The long, honest, uncomfortable dinner where Patrick and I said things we had been carefully not saying for years. That took something from both of us. It took the willingness to sit across from someone you love and tell them the truth anyway, even when the truth is hard to hear and harder to say. I think about Eleanor when I think about all of this. She was the one who taught me that love without honesty is just sentiment. You can feel it, but it won't hold anything up. She held our family up for 38 years with equal parts warmth and straightforwardness, and I watched Patrick set the photograph of himself back on the sideboard at dinner that night, and I thought, she is still in this house. She is still in the way I set the table, and the way I made that pot roast, and the way I refused to go home from that sidewalk without finding a way inside. I am still her husband, and I am still his father. That doesn't expire.